Good afternoon. This is Media Center Ukraine, Odesa, and we continue with the briefing dedicated to human rights violations in the temporarily occupied territories. Our speakers are Vira Yastrebova, Attorney Director of the NGO Східна правозахисна група. Good afternoon, and Irina Chaura, Human Rights Defender of the Східна правозахисна група. Thank you very much for being with us today. As far as I understand, there are a lot of violations, and we will discuss them in more details. And as far as I know, people who don't have Russian passports are not allowed to leave temporarily occupied territories by Russian authorities. Good afternoon. Thank you for providing opportunity to inform about the situation with the human rights violations on behalf of Східна правозахисна група. Ukrainian citizens who refused to get Russian passports are not allowed to leave temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, even to get to the Russian Federation. A special focus on people and citizens with children, because without Russian passports, they cannot control these people and their movements outside the Russian Federation. And this ban to leave territories for such people is also related to the fact that the occupation authorities are afraid that Ukrainian citizens will be able to get their children to the territories of other countries, including Ukraine. And because they want to use forced deportation for the children, to zombify them at schools and other educational institutions. So those who try to save their children try to get them outside Russia, and people who refuse to get Russian passports demonstrate their patriotic pro-Ukrainian position. Others still a lot of Ukrainian citizens, and as far as I understand, occupation authorities don't like them, and they use repressions against them. In the temporarily occupied territories, occupiers continue their repressions against local Ukrainian population. There are mobile phone checks and massive unauthorized searches of the local population, both in public places and in the places of residence. Thus, they grossly violate people's rights. There are quite frequent cases of detention of Ukrainian citizens, in relation to whom accusations of cooperation with the armed forces of Ukraine, of the Special Service of Ukraine, are fabricated. I can make examples. In occupied Berdyansk, the occupation authorities detained Ukrainian citizens, accusing her of allegedly storing ammunition and explosives, and transferring them to the armed forces of Ukraine. She will be tried under Articles 205 and 222 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation. According to these articles, this Ukrainian citizen now faces up to 20 years in prison. A citizen of Donetsk region was detained for tweeting pro-Ukrainian posts, and she was sentenced to 4 years of detention with a 1-year ban on using the internet. FSB in the temporarily occupied Shaslivtsevo detained 55-year-old citizens of Ukraine who in 2015-2016 participated in the public campaign Crimean blockade. He faces up to 15 years in prison. These are only several examples of what occupiers do in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And what is the situation with the socio-economic issues, power supply, salary, water supply, etc. As for socio-economic issues, the situation is the following. In the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, the socio-economic situation is increasingly worsening. Local residents complain about the regular lack of electricity, gas, and water supply. The occupying authorities constantly cut off gas, water, and power supply in entire districts, justifying it by repairs that no one actually does. Also, most industrial facilities in the temporarily occupied territories do not work at all or just open several days a week. There are significant delays in paying wages to employees of enterprises, and there are arrears due to non-payment of salary, which have been increasing. And we can see increased prices for food products and medication. The occupation authorities try to hide those problems of the socio-economic problem. And in the temporarily occupied territories, they just show in their propaganda media that there are no socio-economic problems, and the situation has been improving. And we can also see the big numbers of men forcibly mobilized in the temporarily occupied territories. Ms. Yastrebova, you were here before and during those faked elections in the temporarily occupied territories, and of course we understand that these elections are illegal, and a lot of people refused to vote, and I know that repressions were used against those people as well. Yes, there were quasi-elections in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, forcing citizens to participate in them. Representatives of the so-called election commissions made rounds of houses and public places together with the occupation police and the military of the Russian Federation. They forced locals to participate in these elections. Accordingly, this was done in order to create a good picture for the propaganda media and to try to legitimize the occupation of Ukrainian territories. It also became known to us that in some settlements in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, citizens who refused to participate in this pseudo voting were detained and taken to the occupation police stations. It should be noted that those detentions were public, and I believe that this was used as the tool to put pressure on local residents. The next year, Russia will face the so-called presidential elections. Do you know anything about election campaign in the temporarily occupied territories? And it should be stated that the election commission have not been closed. The election headquarters are there. And now the Kremlin authorities try to prepare election campaign in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And the Kremlin is going to announce the start of the election campaign for the presidential election in the Russian Federation, and they envisaged two stages. The main aim of the Russian Federation to increase the number of people participating, to increase the number of voters, both in the territory of the Russian Federation and in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, because the Kremlin is not satisfied with the amount of voters during these latest faked elections in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. So they created the image of Putin as the refounder of the empire. And also they want to say that the crimes they have been committing in the territory of Ukraine are their achievements. And these are the concepts that will used for this election campaign, and that will be reflected in the propaganda mass media. What is the situation in the temporarily occupied territories with healthcare workers and teachers, and do they agree to work in the condition of occupation? In the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, one of the main problems is still the lack of workers, both for healthcare and education areas. This is primarily due to the fact that the majority of specialists, meaning citizens of Ukraine, left for the controlled territory of Ukraine or abroad after the capture of the territories by the Russian Federation. Russian citizens are actively involved in these areas in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. They encourage them by salary, but even these cannot help to solve the issue of lack of workers in the mentioned areas. The lack of healthcare professionals in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine makes it difficult to ensure proper functioning of the healthcare area and the provision of the medical aid to people they need. After these illegal elections, what is the division of powers there, and who is in head of the local administrations? We can see the trend that collaborators were appointed as the heads of the administrations, those people who agree to cooperate with occupiers. When it comes to the heads of courts, law enforcement, only Russian citizens can occupy those positions, and I can make several examples. Kamp Alexei Georgievich was appointed as acting Minister of Internal Affairs of the so-called Luhansk People's Republic, a citizen of the Russian Federation. Yuri Plodovsky is the head of the FSB department of the Russian Federation. He is also the citizen of the Russian Federation. Gleb Mikhailov is also the so-called prosecutor of the Luhansk People's Republic. He is also a Russian citizen. Oleg Polomoznov was also appointed as the head of the Department of FSB in the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, also a Russian citizen. Podkapayev was appointed as the chairman of the Supreme Court of the Donetsk People's Republic, also a Russian Federation. Actually, when it comes to Supreme Court, it is also involved in terror imposed against the local population. Anton Koltsov, a chairman of the Council of Ministers in the temporarily occupied territory of Zaporizhzhia region. Kirill Osipchuk, a prosecutor in the temporarily occupied Zaporizhzhia region. They are all Russian citizens. Vadim Trotsenko, head of the FSB department of the Russian Federation in the occupied territories of the Kherson region, Russian citizen, and also Andrei Petrov is prosecutor of the occupied part of the Kherson region. He is also a Russian citizen. What does it mean? This means that the Russian Federation just learned its lessons, and now they wanted to use Russian citizens to impose pressure on the local population because they can't believe even collaborators. You mentioned forced mobilization, and as far as I understand, men are sent to the military units which are created in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Yes, that's true. The Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation open military units in the temporarily occupied territories. But apart from the forced mobilization, they also just try to equip the newly created military units. There are the following military units that have been already opened. In Donetsk, military unit 6946, established in February 20 this year. Mariupol in May this year, military unit 1297. In Donetsk, military unit 94917 in August last year. Berdyansk, military unit 94919, and in Luhansk 94918, also established and opened last year. Do you have information about the number of the increase in the number of killed occupiers? Yes, as for increased numbers of the dead occupiers, lately we have seen the significant increase in the number of dead occupiers. This is evidenced by the order of the Ministry of Labor of the Russian Federation. Recently, more than 230,000 certificates have been ordered for family members of the dead occupiers. It should also be noted that this is not the first such an order in recent times. Before that, in May 2023, in the Russian Federation, the agency concluded a state contract worth of 14 million rubles to print documents, including more than 95,000 certificates for the occupiers and more than 23,000 for family members of the deceased occupiers. And one more question. Perhaps you have any information about the compensation which is paid to the families of dead occupiers. Perhaps you have such information. The Russian Federation does everything very possible for them not be able to prove the status of the deceased people. They do this to mobilize as many Russian citizens as possible to kill Ukrainians in our Ukrainian territories. And as far as I understand, in most cases, the bodies are left there. Yes, there are such cases. They are not interested in taking the bodies and to prove the fact that they are dead. And this means that all these certificates were ordered for those people whose death they were not able to conceal. So these are not real numbers. The numbers could be even bigger because of the number of Russian citizens killed in the territory of Ukraine. And I also know that there is Russian propaganda among children, and we can also see militarization of school children. As for the militarization of school children, they have reached the next level. This is evident by the fact that this year the Russian Federation has started buying weapons for school children. Just think of it. Why do they do this? They have spent more than 240 million rubles. That is 8 times more than their expenses on computers and other equipment for computer science classrooms. That weapons have been bought for the rooms of the initial military education. What they have bought: Kalashnikov assault rifles, Makarov pistols, cartridges, bulletproof vests, and other equipment. So we understand what they want the school children to be ready for. And we believe that the Russian Federation is actively militarizing school children, and they also try to educate them to create the next wave of those soldiers that to implement the occupation plans of the Kremlin. And when do they start this military education? It was the first grade, and this is the mandatory part of the program. And they also have ideological campaigns, and they also teach the school children how to deal with weapons, how to use them. And one more question about censorship, and there's wiretapping. They also monitor messages in social media. Yes, this is really so. And recently, the occupation authorities started to wiretapping telecommunications, and they also check messages and mail. Moreover, in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, no rallies, strikes, and just gatherings are allowed. So people cannot go against the occupation regime. The goal is to control the population to the maximum extent possible, the population under occupation, because citizens are immediately taken to different places as part of the repressions for their pro-Ukrainian positions, so that the local population has lost the right to personal opinion, let alone the right to express it anywhere. Thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? Yes. Michael Vasura, Newsweek magazine, generally. Could you compare the situation in different temporarily occupied territories? Do you can see any difference in this in Crimea and the Donbass territory occupied since 2014, and the territories that have been recently occupied since 2023? I can say that the situation is different. We just have covered some individual areas. But I can say the longer Ukrainian territory stays or area under the occupation, the worse situation is there when it comes to social and economic issues, militarization, and we can see the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, which are in a worse condition than other occupied territories. And in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, it is seen that men have been forcibly mobilized to the war initiated by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. And now, because of the deportation of children, because of the forced mobilization of men in the temporarily occupied territories, the Russian Federation does everything possible to substitute population in these temporarily occupied territories. And if, when it comes to temporarily occupied territories in Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts, occupiers try to do everything possible to keep their control, not to allow local population to go against occupiers, not to allow resistance, because we remember how it was during the first day of occupation. There are different challenges posed by Ukrainians for the occupation authorities, but they try to control those territories without solving social issues, economic issues, water supply issues, healthcare issues. So if you are in the occupied territory and you need urgent healthcare aid, you will not be able to get such services because occupiers are focused on the military. The healthcare, all the medication, the focus is the military. And you can also people have lost their right just to have their own opinion. But I believe that the armed forces of Ukraine will be able to squeeze occupier out of our territories, and the control will be restored on those territories, and the situation will be rectified. When they started not allowing people to leave temporarily occupied territories without Russian passport, and what was the first reason for that? The Russian Federation prepared to issue as many Russian passports as possible before the election. But they failed with their plan, and they allowed to use other documents for Ukrainians to participate in voting. And the occupation administrations are just angry with people who want to leave those territories, who refuse to get Russian passports, and they use this ban, this prohibition, as a leverage to issue as many Russian passports to locals as possible. They understand that the people in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine who refuse to get Russian citizens, they want to use Ukrainian passports to just go the long way to come back to Ukraine. That's why the occupiers believe that this is a potential risk for them, and they just impose terror against them. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for doing this important work. Thank you very much for collecting evidence of Russia's crimes against Ukraine, and thank you very much for being with us today. We will continue our work at 2 p.m.